Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Clark, President and CEO of Inflector Environmental Services. We are happy to sponsor and introduce organizational growth, driving process, and innovation feature presentation. Your speaker today is Barry Cross, Assistant Dean of the Professional Graduate Programs at Smith School of Business at Queen's University. Please join me in welcoming Barry. Thank you.
That's all right. I'm going to pull that out anyway. Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Cheers. All right. Good afternoon. How's my volume in the back? Are you guys okay back there? Excellent. Can't hear me. The bar is clearly open. Well, thank you for joining us here this afternoon. I know some more people are going to trickle in and walk through your aisle, so I appreciate your patience with that as we get rolling. I'm looking around the venue here, and I'm thinking back to a conversation we had 5-6 years ago, I guess it was, when we said, hey, you know, what about a symposium? I'm very excited to see the level of growth that the organization and its members have had associated with this event. It's just terrific to see everybody out and to be part of a program like this. Now, I know when you look at the topic, you're saying, okay, interesting, innovation. You're expecting some guy in jeans and a mock turtleneck. Who's this old guy up on stage? Some professor from Queen's. Well, I'll tell you what, I've been enabling and teaching innovation now for about 30 years. So hopefully there's something in our talk here this afternoon that's of meaning for you, something that you can connect with inside of your particular organization. So my plan of work, I want to talk about, why innovation now, especially for organizations like yours. Why does this matter? And then we'll talk about what it may look like for you and your organizations as you go forward. And with the amount of stuff that we've got going on inside of society, especially here, even in Ottawa, there's a lot of things that can have an influence, an undue influence on the way that we work and the way that we do business, right? Maybe there's some things there that we can actually start to capitalize on. All right, so let's start with a bit of an example. And sometimes when we talk about innovation, it is to do with some type of a specific competitive threat. Now, some of you in the room, I know you'll look at this and you'll be of the same vintage I am, and you'll remember those days when people were saying, okay, well, what are these Apple iPhone things? And this is a real discussion back in the day, and if you can't quite read that in the back, it basically is asking the question, is Apple really a threat to BlackBerry? We all know what happened. But think about it, back in the day, BlackBerry's business was actually growing. They were quite strong, doing quite well, thank you. People love the tactile keyboards. People love the security of those particular devices. And you started to say, okay, Apples are kind of nice. They've got, they've got picture capability, they've got browser capability, and they've got, some of these apps and that sort of thing. But then the behavior started to shift. And you started to see people wearing devices on both hips. And some of you will remember those circumstances where you may have been on a BlackBerry for work, and then people were kind of carrying this iPhone around as well. And those are those findings that we refer to, those findings that make no sense. And that's the type of stuff that we have to pay attention to as an organization, focusing on the findings that make no sense. So that's one of the reasons we may look at the idea of innovation and creativity within our sphere of influence. More broadly, sometimes we get situations that I refer to as environmental disturbances. And there's a lot of this kind of thing going on right now. We can talk about the rampant inflation. I was just having a discussion with one of you on the idea of interest rates and the impact that that's had on construction. Not just here in Ottawa, but literally across the world. Talent shortages and trades especially are difficult to come by, even in the best of times. Some of the other elements that we look at, we can talk about the pandemic. The pandemic itself may be over, but its influences are not done yet. These are the things that we have to think about. And sometimes we know that organizations and especially individuals can't be their best unless there's some type of difficulty or challenge going on. So sometimes it's a competitive threat, sometimes it's something more broad like these environmental disturbances. Some of you are looking at this though and you're saying, you know what, we're doing okay. Despite all those other things going on, all of that noise, some of us are doing just fine. So the example there that I want to use is what I'll refer to as, say, that 5-star resort, or a Four Seasons type hotel, a sandals property down in the Caribbean. These are organizations that build a business around the idea of exceeding customer expectations. Again, doing quite well, thank you. So what do they have to worry about despite some of these conditions? I'll tell you what, this chart that I've got here, I'm going to show with this dotted line that I just put up, that's kind of our customer expectations in an environment like this. And we, as I said, as a Four Seasons, as a Sandals, as a Shangri-La type property, make our business by exceeding those expectations. So we're to the right. We're further right of what customers actually expect. Not a bad place to be. So what do we have to worry about? Well, the challenge we've got is when our customers come back again and again. And eventually what you see is this gap between what our customers expect and where we are disappears to the point where our customer gap closes. Our customers become trained, and they're trained up at this level of experience that we've been delivering for them. And therefore their expectations, kind of go up a little bit, and they're looking and saying, yeah, good, what have you done for me lately? So this is what we call the fallacy of falling capability. You haven't done anything wrong, but customer expectations and behavior have started to shift around you. So we've got a responsibility. We've got a responsibility as an organization to start to react. Whatever the influence is on the way that we do business and the way that we work, we have a responsibility to act. And if nothing else, this is us saying that, self-determination is a pretty good place to be. We're going to focus on what we can control and capitalize on that despite some of these other conditions that are going on around us. Now, most of you in the room, within the leadership levels of your organization, you have some focus on creativity. You have some focus on innovation as well. That's built into your core values, perhaps your mission and vision statements. This is part of who you are. Again, it's part of us saying, regardless of the circumstances under which I'm being forced to operate, I am accountable for execution. So here we are. Now the challenge we've got is, as I start to build that innovation strategy, there's a number of barriers that get in the way. And one of the things that I want to introduce here really briefly is this thing that many of you may be familiar with. You can call it a product life cycle or a service life cycle. For us, inside of a discussion around innovation, around sustainability for an organization, we refer to this as a business model life cycle. And this relationship that I've got on the screen here is in fact a law. And at some point, whatever we're doing, however we're operating as an organization, will come to an end. And right now you're seeing, because of some of those environmental disturbances that I referred to earlier, we're seeing situations where we're starting to plateau or flatline a little bit while we wait for things to get better, while we wait for interest rates to improve or access to labor and talent and materials and everything else. So these are some of the barriers and challenges that we're facing, while again, waiting for something to happen. The problem with waiting is that this life cycle comes to an end. This is a law, like gravity. And whatever we're using as an operating model right now will eventually come to an end. Now, for those of us in the room paying attention to this phenomenon, that's okay, because right behind it, there's another one of these curves. And as we respond to those environmental disturbances, we get to define that new way of doing business. And when we start to string together a couple of these business model life cycles, in fact, that's us growing our organization despite some of these cycles that we get into. So the purpose of this diagram is just really a bit of background information. You may be aware of that phenomenon, or really it's just some of those cycles that we go through. Well, this is some of the science behind it. This is some of the economic behavior behind it. And what we're trying to do as an organization is look at this and say, oh, despite this change event that's happening right now, we want to find a way to capitalize on that, prepare for that next curve, and really start to define the way that people in our particular sector are doing business. And that's an incredibly proactive and progressive mindset for a management team. All right, so what is innovation? In most cases, what we talk about are some of these product-based scenarios, and with the lighting that we've got right in front of the screen, it's tough to see that. It's a fancy toaster. Inside of our construction industry, you can think about some of those last great product innovation. You can think about, even battery-powered tools that have been around for now kind of 30 years and how that actually changed the way that we work inside of this sector. I don't want you to worry about a lot of this product-based innovation. That's not us. That will happen for us. Those are large, high R&D type organizations who are spending literally tens and hundreds of millions of dollars a year on developing the next tech, next product type of stuff. That's not who we are. What I want you to think about are more the process and service-based innovation opportunities, which is ultimately the way that we work. It's not about the product-based innovation, it's about the way that we work and the processes and services that define our organizations. This is the type of stuff where you're engaging with clients in new manners. The way that you work, the way that you service, the way that you process. Those are the opportunities that we want to focus on here this afternoon. All right, so naturally there's a bit of a model behind this. You don't need to worry about this too much, but over on the left side, these are, again, those environmental disturbances. And instead of waiting for things to get better, that's where us, the people in this room, are looking at this and saying, you know what, that's our opportunity. That's where we as an organization can say, okay, how are we going to better understand that challenge? How are we going to find a way to capitalize on it and redefine what that space looks like? And inside of that, you know, we've got some ideation, we've got some background research and everything else, but you know what, with every model, there's still some challenges. Worry less about the model. Let's focus on how this gets to be a bit difficult. Your starting place is ultimately saying there is a problem that's keeping us awake at night that we want to understand. We want to tackle this. And everyone in the room, you've got something that's kind of bugging you, something that's kind of nagging you associated with what's going on inside your organizations or perhaps the environment that you service. That's fine, right? There's a challenge that's keeping us awake. An example I've got on the screen, and you'll remember this situation from the pandemic, but if we go back a few years, there were restaurants, there were retail operations, grocery stores that were forced to close their doors, and then when they reopened, they could only reopen to maybe 50% of their available capacity, spacing people out. So in a case like this, let's say you run a restaurant, regulatory restrictions now have imposed a condition that says you can only operate with 50% of your capacity. And you say, okay, well, that's where we are. You think about that for a minute and you say, I understand that, but I'm reluctant to say that this is also going to limit me to 50% of my revenue, 50% of my profitability. That's the problem. And then you say, how would I manage this situation knowing that that's the condition, yet I don't want to be limiting my revenue? And this is where we did all kinds of stuff, right? We said, well, what about takeout, right? What about prepackaged meals? What about limiting our menu to maybe 15 of our best items so that when people actually sat down for dinner, they could order more quickly? Therefore, turn that table around more quickly. People want to go out for dinner in that situation, but they certainly don't want to linger. And if we speed up the process, we have servers ready to get the food out to the table. We will never rush you. Stay as long as you want, but when we're enabling you to get out of there a little more quickly, we turn around our tables maybe 25% more quickly. So this is how it starts. We start with a problem, and we say, okay, well, what's the unusual or unreasonable request? Well, my unreasonable request is I don't want to limit myself to 50% revenue, and therefore we start to come up with some ideas on how to fix it. You've all got situations like that. Now, there's some challenges associated with that as well. Number one, when we're focusing on process innovation, most of our organizations actually struggle with the idea of a process. I am not criticizing. This is normal. Just about every organization I've gone into over the last 30 years has some challenges with the way that they work. So here's a quick example for you. Nobody really owns these processes. I've got one up on the board. It's got 3 stations to it, station 1, 2, and 3. You've got a lineup of customers over here. So my question for the room, right, shout it out if you know the answer. How long does it take to get one customer through that particular process? And I've got some former students in the room, so you better get this question right. How long does it take to get one customer through that process? Yep, 1 minute. Good. So how many customers can I serve in 1 hour? Again, assuming that I've got an unlimited supply of customers here on the left. 60. No, it's not 60. So the answer is 120. And you look at that and you say, well, how is it 120? And what it really gets down to is this station number 2 here, and that's what we call a bottleneck. And a bottleneck is the process defining stage in any process. And I'm not trying to, you know, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we might have had a beer over here. Who said there's going to be a test, right? But the way this works is station number 2 is defining the cadence or the pace of my customers in that process. And what that means, if I've got a lineup of customers, I can get one customer through that process every 30 seconds or 120 an hour. So that's one of the barriers that we face. Somebody in your organization, doesn't matter, you don't need a bunch of them, you don't need somebody who's got a PhD in process optimization, but somebody in your organization needs to understand a process and how to map this stuff out. I'm going to talk about that here in a couple of minutes. Challenge number 2 is what we refer to as drive-by design. And this is where we perceive that our design expertise is more important than our domain ignorance. Right? I'll show you what that means. Over here on the left, you can kind of see an image of a chair, and I took this picture in a hotel that I was staying at out in Calgary. I was giving a talk out there about a year ago. I checked into my hotel. I was getting a bit of work done ahead of time, or I wanted to, and I went to sit down in the chair, and you know what? That's a good-looking chair. I mean, some designer designed this suite, picked this chair out in particular, and said, that's where people are going to sit. The problem is, when I sat down in the chair, my desk was up at about this height. It's completely dysfunctional. The chair itself also looks like something I would sit in if I was drafting a note to the Prime Minister. So I called the front desk and I said, hey, I need a normal desk chair. And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, it's too low, it's dysfunctional. Right? They couldn't help me. Interestingly, about 3 months later, I get an email from the general manager of that property, and he said, yeah, Barry, we've replaced all the chairs in our hotel. But as I said, some designer has looked at this and said, this is the way that I want that suite to look, without actually thinking about how people were going to use the service of that room. It sounds a little rude. All right, here's another one, and this is actually in my neighborhood, and I wish you could see this image a little more clearly. This is about 5 minutes from my house, and there's a lot of building going on in the area. This is advertised as a 2-car garage. And some of you as builders in the room will look at that and just be embarrassed that this could happen. But some owner is going to show up and try to put the second car in that garage. It's not going to work. But again, that's just some designer who's gone and looked at a layout, optimized the layout by the front door, and here we'll put the steps right here, and the steps are just completely blocking access to that second garage bay. Drive-by design. All right, here's another situation, and something that some of you may be familiar with, especially if you've got young children. My question for you in this case, what time do your buses pick up students for high school? And in most cases, when you look at this poll, you say, yeah, the kids are generally getting picked up somewhere around 7:38. They start classes around 8:15, 8:20, something like that. And my next question would be, well, why do they pick up high school age students so early? Generally what happens is that same bus that picks up the high school age students first thing in the morning does a second loop a little bit later to pick up all the elementary and middle school kids. So then I'd say, well, why does that happen? Why are we doing 2 runs? Well, the real answer obviously is cost savings. The Board of Education, anywhere that we live, does 2 runs. They have half as many drivers, half as many buses, because it saves them half the budget associated with busing kids around the neighborhood. Right? The problem with this is that those high school age students now going through puberty, they're staying up a lot later in the evening, they're getting up and fully functioning a lot later in the mornings. And science tells us that those kids are not fully functional until about 9:30 in the morning. It's not their fault. But that's basically at the end of first period physics. So once again, we've designed something without thinking about the end customer or the user in this particular space. So interestingly, some boards are actually flipping this model around. There's a couple of boards in Quebec, there's some down in a few of the states in the US who are saying, and we've all been doing it the same way, but they're flipping this around and they're saying, we're going to pick up the little kids first with the giant backpacks who just want to go off and play with their friends at school. They're good to go at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. They're happy to be there. And what they found in those boards with standardized testing is that the high school age students are doing far better on that second bus run, because we're designing a system with the customer in mind as opposed to imposing this idea of drive-by design. All right, a couple of other quick examples, and I figured because I'm in Ottawa, I could pick on Toronto. Some of you, if you're hockey fans, you'll remember the reverse retro jerseys. They're doing this a lot now across a lot of leagues, and they've got multiple jerseys. You look at this, and some executives sat around the room and they said, you know, hey, that's a really cool color theme. We've got blue on blue, you know, it looks really good. But then when you get into the arena, the fans, the commentators, everybody's looking at that and saying, I can't see the numbers. And the commentators really struggled with being able to identify the players without using the simulation software that they've got up in the booth. So they couldn't see what that number was. They couldn't tell who it was. So these are those drive-by design errors. I wanted to build in a few building examples as well. And again, architecture is capable of a lot of incredible things, but having a pillar right in the center of a hallway, you know, and a door behind a set of steps. Over on the far right, I've got the HVAC instructions for another hotel that I stayed at. This one was out in Vancouver, and I couldn't figure out how to adjust the temperature in the room, so they sent up a one-page 8.5 by 11 sheet of instructions. And I felt kind of silly, but when you read the instructions, it's, you know, stand on one leg, rub your head like this, and then hold the button for 10 seconds. You might be able to change the temperature. So these are some of the barriers. And I want to focus on this for just a second. Inside of you and your organizations is an incredible level of capability and creativity. And what we have to realize is that if we let that creativity go unchecked without some level of guidance, sometimes we come up with stuff like this. And really, there's some easy ways around this, right? And this is where we're going to put a little bit of structure into this and look at what this means for you and your organizations going forward, right? When we truly start to enable what we call design thinking or innovation within an organization like ours, number one, who is our customer? Always, always, always. Who is it that's on the receiving end? Who benefits from what we do? When I start there, I get a better sense of what those people want. What is it that they want to accomplish? And that's that kind of framing exercise we do as an organization to get a sense of, okay, what's going to be most important? Start with that customer. Number two, somebody has to own it. And I refer to these people, this cross-functional team that you develop as T-shaped, right? And T-shaped means we've got kind of broad experience, yet I've got deep, specific knowledge in one or two key areas. You want to have a cross-functional group of people like that. And you think about the experience that you've got across your organizations. Most of you are in good shape, but this cross-functional team, you know, some younger, newer people, some people that have been around for a while, that's where we start. And then once you've got that kind of platform, this is where we say, okay, we're going to start to map the process. And you can do this with a set of Post-it notes, Sharpie markers, you can mess up a whiteboard, however you want to do it. But that that challenge or problem that you want to tackle, it's us getting this up on the board and saying, okay, yeah, that's the way we work right now, and there's the problem that we want to focus on. And having that cross-functional team look at this, you can look at that and say, yeah, it's that middle step right there that we seem to be driving people crazy with. That's where people run into issues with the way that we work. And then from there, it doesn't have to be complicated. Again, once you've got this mapped out, this is where we can say, okay, yeah, I can look at that and I can fix that. You know, and if you've got a fresh pair of eyes or a facilitator or whatever to enable that, you know, get somebody from another department to come in and have a look at this and say, you know what, I'm not really sure what's going on there, but I know there's something that, and it's a bit of that mind block that we've got. And it's like when you look in that junk drawer that we've all got in our kitchen and you know there's a takeout menu from the pizza place right in there somewhere, and you look right in that drawer, you can't find it. Or when my wife sends me out into the garage to grab something off my second shelf and I'm looking right at the thing and I can't see what it is that she wanted me to go and get. It is right there. You've got that mental block that prevents me from being able to see it. That's okay, right? So fresh eyes can help you get around that sometimes. All right, I wanted to walk through just a couple of examples to give you a sense of how this works. Healthcare is one of those challenges that we've got at a society level that's just getting worse. And it's certainly no reflection on the practitioners. These are some of the hardest working, smartest people in society. Yet we've got a capacity problem. If you look at this specifically applied to the geriatric portion of the population, you know, these numbers are going to double and quadruple over the next 20 years. Once these people get into the healthcare system, it's very difficult for them to get out. I go in with a broken hip, and while I'm getting my hip repaired, that I catch something else, some type of an infection, and they end up lingering in the system. And even the practitioners refer to this as a hostile environment. Right, so this is difficult, and we've got to find a way to fix it. Other than building a whole bunch more hospitals and hiring a whole bunch of doctors, that's going to take forever, and it doesn't seem like the government wants to pay for that. So we need some better solutions. So there's a smart guy, his name's Dr. Samir Sina. He's at Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto. And what Dr. Sina has said is, you know what? What if we focused on some process and environmental innovation around our particular geriatric clinic? What if we looked at the way that we worked? So he applied to the board of directors. He said, look, give me $40,000. I want to run a trial, and I promise you this is going to free up capacity for us. And one of his enabling questions, that problem that he identified, he said, you know what, are we a hospital or a hotel? And one of the board members said, Dr. Sina, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, we don't get breakfast in bed at home anymore. Why are we giving patients 3 meals a day in bed? So this is what it looked like. He called it his ACE ward, his acute care for elderly strategy. And what he focused on was really this idea of rest and socialization. And what he said was, we're going to focus on moving these people around. We're going to focus on socialization. So no more meals in bed. 3 times a day, they're going to walk up and down the hallway. Yes, they just had surgery yesterday. We will help them. We'll have some young medical students there helping them up and down the hallways. They can have enabling devices or walkers or whatever it is, but 3 times a day you're getting out of bed, you're walking up and down the hallway. We're going to park a dining room at the end of the hall. Get hurt in a hospital. It's actually getting in and out of bed. The number 1 cause of falls for patients in hospitals is getting in and out of bed because all their beds are up at this height right here. So what they did was, we're going to lower all the beds down to this height. And then we're going to take away their slippers, and we're going to put non-slip socks on their feet. All of this is enabling that early ambulation, that mobile approach, moving around the hospital. What did they find? Right? What did they find? Well, in the first year they ran this experiment, that movement and interaction yielded happier patients. They're busy, they're active, so they're sleeping more soundly in bed, which means that ultimately they checked out more quickly than they were otherwise. They went home. They weren't coming back anytime soon. So the actual data, they reduced the cost of care per patient by 23%. The hospital saved $6 million a year, just in that first year. This system is now being trialed in 14 other hospitals around Canada and another 24 hospitals down south of the border. And it's freeing up capacity and solving the problem by just applying a process and environmental innovation, looking at the way that we work. And it's this type of stuff that's going to help us solve some of these challenges, right? But ultimately, it's about this ongoing creation of value. And you look at this and you say, okay, yeah, I understand that. Society's different today. And perhaps as a result of the pandemic, perhaps, you know, it's social media, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this may be happening, but ultimately, you know, our priorities have shifted. The priorities of just about everybody in the room have shifted here. So it's a matter of saying, how are we going to react to that? And you might look at that list and you might say, okay, Barry, that's interesting, but so what? The so what of it is where I look at these influences and say, well, I can just kind of wait for that to change. Or I can say, perhaps this is an opportunity, something that I want to capitalize on. And if we look at this, you know, we've got a number of these tough questions that I can get a little more specific with. So I want you to think specifically about you and your organization. These are the kind of questions I ask CEOs and leadership within organizations as we start to embark on an exercise like this. But question number 1, how are we different from the firms in our industry? How are we better? Are we truly best at anything, or do we compete on price or convenience? Or perhaps are we relying on demographics? Are we really good at something, or is the growth in the population primarily responsible for us being successful right now? It's an awkward question, but I want you to think about it. What are you truly best at? What are you truly good at as an organization? Or are you getting that business because you picked up the phone that day? Right? So it's intentionally provocative. You know, think about that hospital example. Think about students in our schools. Do you travel to a particular hospital when you've got an acute issue because they are known to have a faster ER? Or because they're truly good at particular services? Where I live about halfway between Kingston and a town called Napanee. It's about 20 minutes to a hospital either way. I know that if I went to Kingston, I'm going to wait in the ER for about 4 hours. If I go to Napanee, it's about 30 minutes. How does a hospital get paid? Well, the hospital gets paid by the number of patients they treat. Same situation. Same with our schools. The schools where our kids go, is it truly a great school and I want my kid being educated there, or is it just that's the neighborhood school, it's convenient? And finally, and I want you to think about a city like Ottawa. Why do people live here? Is it for the work, or is it because Ottawa is truly a great city? And I know Ottawa is a great city. But it's a matter of, you know, us saying at a municipal level now, as a city of Ottawa, as the government, saying, all right, are we truly doing what we need to do to make this a great city? Because we can apply some of the same tools here as well. Right? This applies to all of us. All right, so the outcome of a lot of this type of stuff, and I hope you can read that in the back, but essentially what it's saying is that with all of these environmental disturbances, with all of this kind of noise going on in the background that's affecting every one of our institutions, there truly is no room anymore for mediocrity. Somebody is going to fix that problem. Whatever it is that's keeping you awake at night, somebody's going to fix that. I like the idea of self-determination. I want control of that problem. I want to be the organization or the individuals that sort that problem out. And when we do, we get to redefine what our particular space looks like. All right, so what I want to do, I want to take a quick pause here, and I want you to think about some of the big challenges facing construction. You know, whether it's within the greater Ottawa area, your particular firm, think about those problems that are, causing grief within the construction environment. Right, we know what we are. When I looked at the roster of these great speakers that you had set up through this day, you're talking about a lot of these challenges. Right, when you start to think about some of these things that are, you know, changing the way that we work or causing grief for us, you look at, you know, aging workforce, we look at potential loss of knowledge associated with that. A great session this morning on getting paid within the trade environment. This type of stuff, what I want you to do is I want you to think about this particular page or think about that problem that's keeping you awake at night and say, okay, well, the next step then is for me to get a little group together, this cross-functional group of people that care within my organization and say, you know what, let's talk about that. We may not have a solution today, but somebody out there has solved this problem already, and that's one of the beauties of driving innovation inside of organizations like yours, like ours. It doesn't have to be about big R&D. It can be about us borrowing a solution from another sector, another industry, and saying, okay, yeah, if I apply that right here, that's the kind of thing that can, you know, change the way that we think. All right? So one last example that I've got for you. And I want to use this as a municipal example because, you know, Ottawa, as I said, is a great city, but we do some dumb stuff sometimes, and just the way the LRT was managed, you know, is a good example. And it doesn't seem like you can pick any time of day now. If you're driving along the 417, doesn't matter which way you're going, it's going to be a mess at some point. You know, these are things that cities have been talking about for a long time. Some cities have solved those problems. Those of you who've been to Amsterdam, Amsterdam is a great example of creativity. And I'm not talking about the color of their lighting. Go back to the 70s, and you know, they had drivers, they had motorists, they had people within the construction and transportation industry saying, you know what, we've got to find a way to build more roads. There's more and more cars on the road, we need to find a way to increase the throughput of people trying to move around the city. But you know what, there were already, you know, over 3,000 traffic-related deaths. Parts of the city, historical city, hundreds of years old, were going to be destroyed to build some of these roads. So, you know what? The activists said, you know, we don't have to do it that way. We can be different. Government said, okay, well, if you're thinking about something interesting, we may be able to help enable that. And those of you who've been to Amsterdam, right, this is truly remarkable. This is the city with the most cyclists in the world per capita. They have more bikes in that city than they do people. And in fact, you can cross Amsterdam faster on a bicycle than you can in a car. City of, call it 800,000 people, they've got over 1 million bikes. 38% of all trips are made by bike now. And it's really just because they chose to say, okay, this is our problem. What's a different way for us to look at it? Right? And you take a great city like Ottawa with so much, the canals, the river, everything else, it just, you look at something like that, it seems like a really rich opportunity. Obviously, this is kind of pie in the sky and very long-term thinking, but we can certainly be better. And it doesn't matter who we are, and I'm not picking on Ottawa. We look at the way that we're working, we can certainly be better. All right, so you look at this, and this is where I want you to start picturing that, the end of one of our business model life cycles. I don't mean that to be doom and gloom. It's really recognition that there's another opportunity right behind that. And start thinking about what that next curve looks like. And that's us saying, we're going to solve this problem. And we're going to apply some of these innovation behaviors and tactics to get there. Cross's 10th law. The moment we all think alike is the moment we stop thinking. All right, so I do want to wrap up with a quick story. The story is about a guy named Peter Drucker. And a few years ago, and sadly Drucker passed away a few years ago, but before he died, he was giving a talk at a conference. And after the talk was over, a young gentleman walked up and he was shaking his hand and he was saying, thank you, Mr. Drucker, I really enjoyed your talk. And as he was talking to him, Peter Drucker could tell that the young man was a little bit on edge. And he said, young man, you seem very anxious. Is everything okay? And the young man said, well, Mr. Drucker, if I'm honest about it, I find myself being very, very consumed right now with being successful. And Drucker is a longtime management guru, management thinker. He's been around forever, and he's seen all kinds of cases like this. And he kind of nodded his head for a moment, and he said to the young man, I understand, but I'll tell you what, focus more of your attention on being useful. And if you can do that, success will come. Now, the young man's name was Jim Collins, and he went on to write a book called Good to Great and found a very successful consulting practice as well. He's been around forever himself now. So I think he found a way to be useful. The impact, though, the purpose of that final story is just to think about our organizations and think about the value that you create. When we find a way to be useful, success is going to come. All right, so with that, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your time today, out of your schedules and everything else. It's just a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got, and I will stick around for a bit afterwards if anybody wants to talk one-on-one, if you've got questions at all. All right, so thank you very much.